2 summers ago, a high school teacher in Arizona named Renee did her weekly grocery run, exactly like she always does. Same store, same cart, eggs, a gallon of milk, a loaf of bread, 2 pounds of ground beef, a rotisserie chicken, a bag of rice. The total came to $58. Last month, she ran the exact same list. Same store, same cart, same items, down to the brand. The total was $89. She didn't buy more, she didn't trade up to anything fancier. She bought exactly what she always buys and somehow got charged 53% more for it. Here's the part that actually broke her. In that same stretch, her paycheck went up about 9%. Cost of living raise, step increase, the whole deal. On paper, she's making more money than she's ever made in her life. So why does she feel poor? She did the math herself, standing in a parking lot with 2 receipts and a calculator app, and came up with a number that should scare you a little. For every dollar she earns now, she can buy meaningfully less than she could buy 3 years ago. Her income went up, her actual life got smaller. She started doing this little experiment every few months after that, just to see. 6 months later, the gap had only gotten wider. She wasn't imagining it, and she definitely wasn't bad with money. She just stumbled completely by accident onto something millions of people feel every single week, and almost nobody can actually explain out loud, including most of the people whose job it is to explain it.
This isn't a video about eggs. It's not really about groceries at all. It's about a silent tax nobody voted for that's been quietly resizing your paycheck for years. And almost nobody bothers to explain how it actually works, just that it does. The people who write the headlines about it usually can't even agree on what's causing it. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand your own paycheck better than most of the people paid to talk about the economy on television. Canon here, and I spend way too much time thinking about why the number on your pay stub keeps climbing while the version of life that number can actually buy keeps shrinking. If you've ever felt like you're working harder and somehow falling further behind, hit subscribe, because we're about to fix that feeling permanently. That's not a compliment to you. It's an insult to every economics class that made this sound complicated on purpose. Okay, let's start stupidly simple, because everyone overcomplicates this on purpose, including, frankly, a lot of economists. Inflation is not eggs being greedy. It's not a vide. It's a measurement. Every month, the government tracks the price of a fixed basket of stuff regular households actually buy. Food, rent, gas, healthcare, a haircut, a used car. They add up what that basket costs this month and compare it to what it costs a year ago. That comparison is called the Consumer Price Index, and the percentage change is the inflation rate you hear about on the news. Right now, it's hovering in the low single digits. Back in the middle of 2022, it spiked above 9%, the worst stretch in over 40 years. Same basket, same households, wildly different price tag.
That basket isn't weighted evenly either. Housing alone makes up roughly a third of it, because rent and the cost of owning a home eat up more of a typical paycheck than almost anything else does. Food and energy are in there too, but they're also the most volatile pieces month to month, which is why you'll sometimes hear about core inflation, a stripped-down version of the number with food and energy removed, specifically so one bad month for gas prices doesn't make the entire report look misleading in either direction. The headline number is the one that actually affects your life. The core number is the one economists watch to guess where the headline number is heading next. Here's the part that 90% of people get backwards, and it's the single most important idea in this entire video. Inflation isn't really about prices going up. Prices going up is just the symptom. Inflation is about your dollar getting weaker. Same dollar, less buying power. Every single year that prices rise faster than your income does. A dollar today does not buy what a dollar bought 5 years ago, and it will buy even less 5 years from now, guaranteed, because a small amount of inflation is actually the goal. The Federal Reserve doesn't aim for zero inflation. It aims for about 2% a year, on purpose, because a little bit of rising prices keeps the economy moving and keeps debts from feeling crushing over time. The problem isn't that inflation exists. The problem is when it runs hotter than your paycheck. So here's the rule. Tattoo it somewhere.
It is never about what your paycheck says. It is only ever about what your paycheck buys. A 10% raise during 8% inflation is basically a 2% raise. A frozen salary during 4% inflation is a 4% pay cut you never agreed to and never got a memo about. Every single thing we're about to cover, every disaster, every shock, every quiet erosion is just this.
And the first place this rule mugs people is the most boring, supposedly safest place they keep their money, a basic savings account. Picture Renee again. Say she's got $10,000 sitting in a savings account paying her bank's standard rate of about 0.5% a year. Meanwhile, inflation that year runs at 3%. Her balance grows by $50. Her cost of living grows by $300. She didn't lose money on paper. Her account went up. But in real terms, the terms that actually matter, the terms that determine what she can buy, she just got $250 poorer for the crime of doing exactly what every financial advisor on earth told her to do: save her money safely. This is called a negative real interest rate, and for most of the last few years, it's exactly what was happening to anyone who kept meaningful cash sitting in a typical checking or savings account. The bank wasn't stealing from her. Inflation was. The bank just happened to be standing there. Stretch that same math out over 10 years instead of 1, and the damage compounds in a way most people never bother to calculate. $10,000 sitting in a savings account paying 0.5% a year against an average inflation rate of even a modest 3% doesn't just lose a little ground. It loses real purchasing power every single year, compounding against you instead of for you, until that same $10,000 buys meaningfully less than it would have bought a decade earlier, even though the number on the statement never once went down. Quick favor before we go further. If this is making your brain itch a little, in a good way, hit the like button. It costs nothing, and it tells the algorithm that people actually want to understand their own money instead of just being told to budget harder. Okay, back to it.
Now, let's zoom out from Renee's kitchen table to the whole country, because this exact mechanism just played out at a scale that reshaped the entire economy in under 2 years. In 2020 and 2021, the government pumped trillions of dollars into the economy through stimulus checks, expanded unemployment benefits, and emergency lending, while the Federal Reserve simultaneously held interest rates near zero and bought trillions in bonds to keep money flowing. At the same moment, factories were shut down, ships were stuck outside ports, and an entire generation of people who'd been stuck at home suddenly had cash and nowhere to spend it except on physical stuff. You had a flood of extra dollars chasing a supply chain that had shrunk. Basic economics says when more money chases the same or fewer goods, prices rise. They didn't just rise, they ripped. By June of 2022, the consumer price index hit just over 9% year over year, a number most people under 50 had genuinely never seen in their adult lives. Economists still argue about exactly how much of that spike came from the extra money sloshing around versus the snarled supply chains versus companies simply raising prices because they could get away with it once everyone already expected higher prices anyway. The honest answer is probably some blend of all three, and reasonable people disagree on the exact mix. What's not really up for debate is what happened next. The Federal Reserve panicked, for good reason, and did the only blunt tool it has. It jacked interest rates from near zero to over 5% in about a year and a half, the fastest tightening cycle in 4 decades. That's the same lever from the bond market we'd cover in a different video, and it's why your mortgage, your car loan, and your credit card interest rate all spiked at the exact same time your groceries did. The Fed wasn't trying to punish you. It was trying to make borrowing and spending expensive enough to cool the economy down and slow the price spiral before it became permanently baked into people's expectations.
For roughly 2 years straight, average wage growth across the country simply couldn't keep pace with how fast prices were climbing, which meant most workers were technically taking real pay cuts, even while their paychecks, in raw dollar terms, kept going up every year. That's the exact rule from the start of this video, just playing out across an entire labor market at the same time. Because here's the part that's genuinely scary about inflation once it gets moving. If workers expect prices to keep rising, they demand higher wages. If businesses expect wages to keep rising, they raise prices to cover it. That's called a wage price spiral. And once it starts, it can feed itself for years, Like the country got stuck in the 1970s when inflation stayed brutally high for the better part of a decade, and it took a brutal recession to finally choke it out. And if you want to see this exact same rule running completely off the rails with no brakes left at all, look at Zimbabwe in the late 2000s. The government kept printing money to cover its own spending while the broader economy was collapsing, and the result wasn't a sluggish 4 or 5% a year. By late 2008, inflation there was running so hot that economists couldn't even agree on a single believable number, with some estimates landing somewhere in the hundreds of billions of percent annually. The government eventually issued a $100 trillion note, a single piece of paper with 12 zeros printed on it, that could lose a meaningful chunk of its value by the time you carried it home from the bank. People started spending their pay the same day they got it, because waiting even 24 hours could cost them real purchasing power. Eventually, the country gave up on its own currency entirely and started using US dollars instead, because at least those held their value overnight. It sounds like a cartoon.
It happened to real people with real jobs, real savings, and real retirement plans. All of it wiped out by the exact same rule we just covered, just turned up to a setting most economies never get anywhere close to. Almost no country will ever see anything like that. But it's the purest version of the lesson. A currency is only worth something because people trust it'll buy roughly the same amount of stuff tomorrow as it does today. And the moment that trust breaks, the number on your paycheck turns into a punchline. Here's where it gets genuinely uncomfortable, because inflation does not hit everyone equally, and the people it hits hardest are almost never the people you'd expect from the news coverage. Picture two households. One owns their home with a fixed 30-year mortgage and a portfolio of stocks. The other rents an apartment and keeps their savings in cash because the stock market feels too risky and scary. When inflation runs hot, the homeowner's mortgage payment literally does not change, while their home's value and their stock portfolio both tend to rise right along with prices, sometimes faster. Their debt is getting cheaper in real terms every single year. Meanwhile, the renter gets hit with a new, higher lease every 12 months, watches their cash savings quietly shrink in real value, and owns no assets that rise alongside the very prices that are squeezing them. Same inflation rate, two completely different financial outcomes. This is the part nobody puts in the headlines. Inflation is, in practice, a wealth transfer from people who hold cash and debt-free renters to people who hold assets and fixed-rate debt. It's not a conspiracy. Nobody designed it this way on purpose. It's just math, quietly running in the background of everyone's life, deciding who gets richer and who gets squeezed, almost entirely based on what they happen to own before the inflation started. Run the actual numbers and it gets almost uncomfortable to watch. Someone who bought a $300,000 house with a fixed 4% mortgage back in 2020 is 5 years later still paying that same roughly
Quick reality check before this next part. I'm not a financial advisor, and none of this is personalized financial advice. This is the stuff I wish someone had explained to me before I just accepted that prices going up was simply how the world worked, and there was nothing to do about it. First, stop letting meaningful cash rot in a basic savings account paying less than inflation. High-yield savings accounts, money market funds, and short-term treasury bills are currently paying multiple times what the national average savings rate pays. And at minimum, that closes most of the gap between your cash and inflation, instead of guaranteeing you lose ground every single year. Second, learn to check your real return, not your nominal return, on everything. If your raise was 4% and inflation that year was 4%, you did not get a raise. You got a cost of living adjustment, which is a very different thing, and you should stop celebrating it like a win. Third, understand that owning some assets, not all your money, but some, in things that have historically grown faster than inflation over long periods, like a diversified index fund or your own home, is one of the only realistic long-term defenses against this entire mechanism, because cash, by design, is built to lose to inflation over time. Fourth, if you specifically want an investment built to track inflation directly, Treasury inflation-protected securities, called TIPS, and Series I savings bonds both adjust their payouts based on the actual CPI number, so you're not guessing.
You're getting paid to keep pace with the exact thing that's been quietly squeezing you. And fifth, watch the monthly CPI report the same way you'd watch a check engine light. It comes out once a month, it takes about 30 seconds to understand the headline number, and it tells you whether the ground under your paycheck is stable or shifting, months before it shows up in your grocery bill.
And sixth, if you're early in your career, your single biggest inflation hedge probably isn't a financial product at all. It's your own skill set. Wages tied to a job that's easy to replace tend to get negotiated downward in real terms almost automatically, year after year. Wages tied to a skill that's genuinely hard to replace tend to outrun inflation by a wide margin because employers will pay up in nominal dollars before they'll risk losing someone they can't easily backfill. Here's the thing nobody tells you about inflation. You've been living inside this mechanism your entire adult life, whether you noticed it or not. Every grocery run, every lease renewal, every time your savings account statement looked fine but somehow didn't feel fine, you were inside this system the whole time. You just never got handed the explanation because a confused population is, frankly, a much easier population to sell things to. But now you know the one rule everything in this video runs on. It's never about the number on your paycheck. It's only ever about what that number can still buy. You've watched it quietly cost a school teacher $250 for doing exactly what she was told. You watched it spike hard enough to flip the entire global interest rate environment in under 2 years. You've even seen what this same rule looks like when nobody ever puts the brakes on at all the way out at the Zimbabwe end of the scale. And you've watched two neighbors with the exact same income end up on completely opposite sides of their own financial future, based on nothing more than what they happen to own going in. You don't need an economics degree. You just need to stop being the only person at your kitchen table who doesn't know why the number went up and the life it buys went down anyway. Because that gap is going to keep existing whether you understand it or not. The only real question is whether you can finally see it coming. And if this video just made you realize you could explain money this clearly to other people,